Hello and welcome, my name is Charlie Roscoe, and for once I'm doing a livery and not live streaming it. I figured since I've already done this livery before on the Porsche 911 RSR that I wouldn't dedicate a whole live stream to it. Having said that, it was a racing livery off an RX7, so it needed to be done, and will become car number 2 in my fleet of RX7s that I'm going to create. I've compressed the video into a convenient time-lapse for your viewing pleasure, and I figured I'd spend the rest of the video telling you a little about this car and why it's so iconic for Rotary enthusiasts. Before I get into that, I just want to give a quick shout out to Piosco for creating the Peter Stuyvesant International decals and uploading them into Gran Turismo for me. The man does great work and actually takes requests from his subscribers, turning some of them into videos on his channel, so make sure you go subscribe to him. You can find him by searching for Piosco, plus I'll link his channel in the description. I also want to preface this video by saying that I'm borrowing information from other people's work, and sometimes quoting them directly, so please see the description for all of my references. Now, coming back to this car, what it is, whose it was and why it's awesome, it was Allan Moffat's 1984 RX7 from the Australian Touring Car Championship, or the ATCC. Who's Allan Moffat? He's a Canadian-Australian racing driver known for his 4 wins in the Australian Touring Car Championship, 6 wins in the Sandown 500 and his 4 wins in the Bathurst 500 and 1000. He originally entered the championship in 1965 driving a Lotus Cortina, and following this he spent time in the United States where he drove in the new Trans Am series in 1966. By 1969 Moffat had returned to live full-time in Australia, and from 1969 he'd become a regular ATCC competitor in his bright red Coca-Cola sponsored Ford Boss 302 Mustang. However, he's probably best known for racing Ford Falcons and went on to win the 1976 and 1977 championships in them. In 1973, CAMS introduced a new Group C touring car category to replace both the existing Group C Improved Production and Group E Series Production. It was a series that was battled as fiercely in the courtroom as it was on the racetrack. An era full of controversy, but no car created more controversy, heated debate and political division during this volatile time than the Mazda RX-7. During that volatile period, Australian Mazda distributors and their new racing figurehead Allan Moffat battled the Confederation of Australian Motorsport, or CAMS, in seeking approval to race the RX-7 as an outright Group C contender. It had already gained FIA approval to compete as the Group 1 touring car. Even so, critics claim that it was a sports car that should never have been granted approval to compete against traditional 2- and 4-door sedans. At the root of the Australian controversy was Mazda's request to use peripheral porting on its 12A Rotary engine. This was a high-performance factory modification used only on Mazda competition engines, as it was not suitable for road car applications due to unacceptable noise and exhaust emissions. I acknowledge that a lot of you won't understand what I mean when referring to porting, but without giving you a lesson on how rotary engines differ, substantially by the way, from a reciprocating piston engine, let's just say peripheral port is the ultimate form of porting for a rotary engine without turning to forced induction. In effect, it was no different to fitting larger inlet valves and hotter camshaft to a conventional reciprocating engine for competitive use. But a rotary engine doesn't have valves or camshafts, and therein lay the fundamental problem. People didn't understand it, and it's human nature to fear what you don't understand. The whole controversy really is a fascinating story, and I recommend you read the article I've put in the description. But to cut to the chase, after CAMS provisionally approved the RX-7 with peripheral porting in 1979 to compete in the over 3 litre class, after all the objections had been raised, after CAMS had flip-flopped on their decision a few times, there was actually support for the little Japanese bumblebee, and none more high profile than Holden hero Peter Brock, who after 2 seasons of Holden domination needed someone to beat. In fact, when in 1980 CAMS still couldn't decide if the car could race, Moffat actually guest drove an HTT Commodore to 2nd place behind teammate Peter Brock at the Sandown 400. There was no doubt Brocky's support helped Mazda's cause, and most of the track promoters were also on side, along with motorsports press and public too. Finally, Moffat drove the car in the final round of the Australian Sports Sedan Championship at Sandown Park in December. It was simply to prove that the peripheral port RX-7 wasn't the world beater its critics said it was. Even Peter Brock had to drive to ensure there was no sandbagging going on. Finally, in January 1981, the governing body announced that the peripheral port RX-7 had been approved to compete as an outright contender in the Australian Group C touring car racing. There would be no more rejections. Unfortunately, due to the late approval date, racing in the 1981 Australian Touring Car Championship wasn't going to be a possibility, but they did race in the Sandown 400 and Bathurst 1000 later in the year. Under the bonnet was Mazda's tiny twin-chamber 1146cc 12A Rotary engine hand-built for competition use by the factory in Japan, with its peripheral ports fed by a single 48mm IDA downdraft Weber twin-choke carburettor mounted on a pair of elegantly simple cast aluminium inlet runners. Power from the factory-supplied engines was quoted at around 260 to 270 brake horsepower at 7.5 to 8,000 RPM. Redline was set at 8,500 RPM, but revs could stretch to a screaming 9,000 with safety. The BMW and Mazda would face off for class honours in the newly created 6-cylinder and Rotary class in the Bathurst 1000, where the RX7 turned in a remarkable debut on the mountain that really opened people's eyes to its outright race-winning potential in endurance racing. The Mazda became the first non-V8 powered car to qualify for the prestigious Top 10 qualifying shootout. On a rain-soaked track, Moffat did a brilliant job to take the 5th fastest time before finishing 3rd outright in the race with British co-driver Derek Bell. The car raced between 1981 and 1985, and during that time it won the overall Australian Touring Car Championship in 1983, as well as 3 podium finishes at the Bathurst 1000 in 81, 83 and 84. It won the endurance title in 82, 83 at the hands of Peter McLeod, and again in 1984. Internationally, the car came 21st in the Daytona 24-hour in 1980, and a 13B powered version placed 14th in 1982. Hopefully you have enjoyed watching that famous car's livery get recreated on the FD RX7, and hopefully you've enjoyed the fascinating story behind it. If you think I've earned a like, then please give it a click. Thank you all very much for joining me. Bye for now.